In Chicago, not every border appears on a map. Some borders are learned before they are ever explained. A teenager can grow up knowing which corner to avoid, which symbol not to wear, which hand sign can turn a normal afternoon into a threat. A mother can know which route her son should take home from school, not because the city drew a line there, but because the street did. On the south side, that invisible border was not created by city planners. It was drawn by power, by fear, by two men whose names became larger than the neighborhoods that made them. Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover were both born poor, both born in Mississippi, both carried north into Chicago by families chasing something better. But the city they entered was already wounded. And by the time they were done, that wound had a new shape. People nation, folk nation, 5-point stars, 6-point stars, two systems, two flags, two prison kings, and a city forced to live between them. How did two boys from Mississippi draw a line through Chicago that people are still living with decades later? To understand that invisible border, you have to go back before the nations, before the supermax cells, before the names became legends. You have to go back to the migration that brought them north. Before Chicago had folk and people, before the symbols split blocks into invisible territories, before Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover became names whispered with fear, both were children from Mississippi. Jeff Fort was born in Aberdeen in 1947. Larry Hoover was born in Jackson in 1950. Their families were part of a much larger movement of black families leaving the South for northern cities, searching for work, safety, dignity, and a future that Jim Crow America had tried to deny them. Chicago promised industry, neighborhoods, wages, and possibility. But for many families who arrived on the South Side, the promise was incomplete. The city had jobs, but not enough. Housing, but often segregated and neglected. Schools, but not always protected from the same poverty waiting outside their doors. Fort's family settled in Woodlawn. Hoover's family settled in Englewood. Two neighborhoods close enough to share the same pressures, but distinct enough to produce different loyalties, different crews, and different forms of ambition. Neither boy was born a king. That matters, because the story is often told as if men like Fort and Hoover simply appeared from the streets fully formed, already dangerous, already destined to rule. But they were children first. They learned from the world around them. They watched who had power and who did not. They saw what official systems promised and what they failed to deliver. In neighborhoods where institutions were weak, the street could begin to look like structure. A gang could offer what the city did not: protection, identity, money, discipline, and a sense that someone was finally listening. That does not excuse what Fort and Hoover would build, but it helps explain why boys with unusual gifts for leadership could find their audience in places where legitimate power felt distant. Fort had a gift for bringing people together. Hoover had a gift for reading power and organizing men around it. In another life, those gifts might have built businesses, movements, churches, unions, or political machines. In Southside Chicago, those gifts became something else. They became tools for building street empires. And once both boys learned that organization could turn fear into authority, Chicago would begin moving toward a collision that no one in Mississippi could have imagined. Jeff Fort's early power did not come from being the loudest boy on the block. It came from something more dangerous. People listened to him. Before the headlines, before the federal cases, before the word terrorism was attached to his name, Fort was known for a strange kind of calm. Around Woodlawn, people saw that he could settle disputes, bring angry young men into the same room, and make separate crews believe they were stronger together than apart. They called him Angel. That name is hard to reconcile with the man he later became, but it reveals something important. Fort's gift was never simply violence. Violence was common. What made him different was the ability to organize it, contain it, and give it a structure that others could follow. By the time he was still a teenager, Fort had helped create something much larger than a neighborhood crew. He drew separate gangs into a federation, giving scattered groups a shared identity, a chain of command, and a governing body that became known as the Main 21. For young men used to small crews, personal conflicts, and block-by-block rivalries, this was a different kind of power. Fort was not only asking them to fight, he was asking them to belong to a system. That is what made him so effective. A single gang can control a corner. A federation can control a map. A young leader with enough charisma can turn resentment into loyalty, loyalty into numbers, and numbers into political weight. In the 1960s, as Chicago struggled with poverty, segregation, and unrest, Fort understood that the streets were not only violent, they were organized enough to be mobilized. But every structure has a moral direction. A structure can protect a community, or it can capture one. Fort's organization presented itself at times as discipline, unity, and local power. But underneath that language was the reality of intimidation, criminal influence, and young men learning that belonging came with obedience. This is the tragedy of Jeff Fort's early rise. The same gift that once made people call him angel became the gift that allowed him to build something capable of frightening an entire city. He could calm a room, but he could also command it. He could stop conflict, but he could also redirect it. He could make boys feel seen, then place them inside a machine that demanded loyalty before conscience. And once Fort understood that organization could make the street speak with one voice, he began reaching for more than street respect. He reached for legitimacy. He reached for political language. He reached for federal money. And for a brief moment, the same government that feared Chicago's gang violence would help fund the structure growing beneath it. In the late 1960s, Jeff Fort learned something that many street leaders never understood. Power does not always need to hide. Sometimes power can put on a suit, create an organization, fill out paperwork, and speak the language of reform. In 1967, Fort helped create the Grassroots Independent Voters of Illinois, a nonprofit that presented itself as a community program. On paper, it was about opportunity, job training, youth development, anti-poverty work in neighborhoods where the federal government knew something had gone badly wrong. And in that language, the program made sense. Chicago's South Side had young men with no stable work, no clear future, and no trust in official institutions. A program promising to reach them directly could look innovative. It could look practical. It could look like exactly the kind of local solution Washington wanted to support. The federal government approved nearly $1 million. Gang members were placed on payroll as job training instructors. Officials praised the idea. The program was treated, for a moment, as a possible bridge between the streets and the system that had failed them. But beneath the official language, the line between community work and street power was already collapsing. The same organization that could mobilize young men for a federal program could also mobilize them for Fort. The same structure that made the grant attractive made the street empire stronger. Money gave legitimacy. Legitimacy gave access. Access gave Fort something more valuable than cash alone. It gave him recognition. That is what makes this chapter so unsettling. It was not simply a case of money disappearing into the wrong hands. It was proof that a street organization had learned how to borrow the vocabulary of reform while maintaining the logic of control. The government thought it was funding opportunity. Fort understood that organization itself was power, no matter what name appeared on the paperwork. Then the scrutiny came. Congressional investigators began asking questions. Reports of misuse, corruption, and violence surrounding the program became impossible to ignore. When Fort was brought before a Senate subcommittee, the confrontation became almost symbolic. The government wanted answers from the man it had indirectly helped empower. Fort refused to give them. He would not explain. He would not cooperate. He would not surrender the dignity of silence in a room built to expose him. That silence cost him. But the larger damage had already been done. The poverty program revealed a truth Chicago would see again and again. When official power leaves a vacuum, unofficial power learns to imitate it. A gang can become a nonprofit. A street leader can become a community representative. Reform can become camouflage. And once that happens, even the people trying to solve the problem may help feed the machine. While Fort's organization learned to wear the mask of civic action, another young leader in Englewood was building power by a different method. Larry Hoover was not looking for federal grants yet. He was learning how to turn chaos into command. While Jeff Fort was building power in Woodlawn, Larry Hoover was coming up in Englewood. He was younger than Fort, but he understood something similar very early. The streets did not reward confusion. They rewarded structure. A group without leadership could be scattered, arrested, absorbed, or erased. A group with discipline could grow. Hoover was still a teenager when he began to rise. After the leader of his gang was killed, he did not disappear into fear. He stepped into the space that death had opened. That decision tells you a lot about the kind of young man he was becoming. Where others saw danger, Hoover saw a vacancy. Where others saw chaos, he saw an opening for control. By his mid-teens, he had helped grow the Supreme Gangsters into a force large enough to matter beyond one block. But Hoover's real talent was not only expansion, it was alliance. That is where David Barksdale enters the story. Barksdale, known as King David, led the Black Disciples. He had his own followers, his own reputation, and his own power. In another city, men like Hoover and Barksdale might have spent years trying to destroy each other. But Chicago's gang landscape was changing. The streets were becoming too large, too violent, and too crowded for every leader to stand alone forever. So they met. Not in a back alley, not in a nightclub, but in a church. St. Stephen's Parish House in Englewood became the place where one of the most important gang alliances in Chicago history took shape. Out of that meeting came the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, a merger that joined Barksdale's Black Disciples with Hoover's Supreme Gangsters and created a force with the numbers, symbols, and structure to reshape the South Side. Barksdale held the title of King. Hoover became chairman. Those titles mattered because they were more than nicknames. They gave the organization a political feeling, a sense of order, a hierarchy that made young members feel they were part of something larger than a street crew. Hoover understood the psychology of structure. Men obey more easily when the system around them looks permanent. But every alliance built in violence carries a weakness. It depends on personalities. It depends on trust. It depends on whether the people at the top can survive long enough to hold the structure together. For a brief moment, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation looked like a new center of power. But Chicago's streets had a way of breaking every truce, every merger, and every promise of unity. Soon, Barksdale would be wounded, Hoover would be tested, and the young chairman would begin moving toward a throne that would not be built outside prison, but inside it. Power in Chicago did not only rise through meetings and alliances, it also rose through wounds. On June 7, 1970, David Barksdale and Larry Hoover were at a bar on West 69th Street in Englewood when violence broke through a fragile truce. Accounts differ on whether the shooting was accidental or deliberate, but the result was the same. Barksdale was hit. The bullet tore into his side and damaged him in a way that would never fully heal. Hoover got him into a car and rushed him to St. Bernard's Hospital. Doctors later said that action helped save Barksdale's life that night. But survival was not the same as recovery. The damage to his kidney started a slow decline, and everyone close to the organization could feel that the throne of King David was no longer secure. Then came the killing that would define Hoover's own future. In 1973, William Pookie Young, a 19-year-old drug dealer, was accused of stealing from the gangster disciples. In the world Hoover helped build, theft was not treated as a mistake. It was treated as betrayal, and betrayal had to be answered in a way that everyone else could understand. Young was killed. He was 19. That detail matters, because in stories about empires, young victims often disappear behind the names of powerful men. They become case details, court records, background evidence. But William Young was not only a reason Hoover went to prison, he was a human being whose life ended inside the logic of a system that treated loyalty, money, and fear as more valuable than mercy. Hoover was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison. For most men, that would have been the end of power. For Hoover, it became a transformation. He entered Stateville not as a free leader removed from the board, but as a symbol. In prison, instead of cutting him off from influence, gave him a new kind of stage. Behind the walls, he could still command respect. He could still communicate. He could still study hierarchy, negotiate with rival leaders, and turn confinement into authority. Then in 1974, David Barksdale died from complications tied to the old wound. He was only 27 years old. With Barksdale gone and Hoover already locked away, the organization entered a new phase. The chairman became something larger than a street leader. He became a prison king, a man whose sentence was supposed to bury him, but instead made his name feel permanent. That is one of the darkest truths in this story. Sometimes prison does not end an empire. Sometimes it gives the empire a myth. And from inside Stateville, Larry Hoover would begin building the framework that turned Chicago's gangs into two opposing nations. By the late 1970s, Larry Hoover understood that Chicago's gang world could not be controlled one crew at a time. There were too many names, too many grudges, too many neighborhoods, too many young men willing to die for symbols they barely understood. If power was going to last, it needed a larger structure, not just a gang, not just an alliance between two leaders, a framework big enough to absorb rivalries, organize loyalties, and make every smaller group choose a side. That framework began inside prison. In 1978, from Stateville, Hoover helped create Folk Nation, a coalition that brought different gangs under one broad identity. Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Simon City Royals, Spanish Cobras, Maniac Latin Disciples, Imperial Gangsters, and others could all exist under the same larger umbrella. They did not have to become identical. They only had to understand where they stood. The symbols gave the coalition a language. The 6-point star, the pitchfork, the number 6. To outsiders, these could look like graffiti, tattoos, hand signs, or prison markings. But inside the streets, they were coordinates. They told people who belonged where, who could be trusted, who was an enemy, and what side of the invisible map someone stood on. Jeff Fort watched this from the other side of Chicago's power struggle, and he answered. By 1981, People Nation emerged as the rival coalition. El Rukns, Vice Lords, Latin Kings, Mickey Cobras, Four Corner Hustlers, and other groups aligned under a different symbolic world. The 5-point star, the crescent moon, the number 5, a mirror image, a counterweight, a second nation built to oppose the first. This is how Chicago became two maps. There was the official map, streets, wards, schools, parks, public housing, train lines, churches, storefronts. Then there was the other map, folk or people, 5 or 6, this side or that side, safe block or dangerous block, colors that could be misunderstood, signs that could get someone hurt, corners where an old conflict could still decide the future of a young person who had not been born when the line was drawn. That is the part people outside the city often miss. A gang coalition is not only a structure for criminals, it becomes a pressure system for everyone around it. Children learn the borders before they understand the history. Families adjust their roots. Schools inherit conflicts they did not create. A basketball court, a hallway, a bus stop, or a corner store can become part of a political geography no city planner ever approved. Hoover and Fort did not build nations in the way governments build nations. They built nations without citizenship, nations without freedom, nations where belonging could mean protection one day and danger the next. And the most haunting part is that both systems were built by men who were already being contained, watched, arrested, or imprisoned. Physical confinement did not stop their ideas from moving. The symbols moved faster than their bodies ever could. By the late 1980s, the coalitions had spread far beyond their original neighborhoods. What began as a way to organize Chicago's gang landscape became a code that could travel through prisons, streets, and cities across the country. The Kings did not need to stand on every corner. They only needed the border to be believed. And once enough people believed in it, Chicago was no longer just one city. It was two invisible countries occupying the same streets. Jeff Fort had already built power on Chicago blocks. But by the mid-1980s, blocks were no longer enough. His organization had evolved from the Black Pea Stone world into the El Rukns, operating out of a converted theater on South Drexel Boulevard that followers called the Fort. The name fit. It was not only a building, it was a symbol of what Fort believed he had become. Not just a street leader, but the ruler of a disciplined organization with its own territory, language, hierarchy, and political imagination. Then his ambition crossed a line that changed how the federal government saw him forever. Fort learned that Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi had given money to Louis Farrakhan. To most people, that would have been international politics, ideology, or foreign influence far beyond the South Side. But Fort saw something else. He saw a market. If a foreign leader was willing to fund political allies in America, Fort believed his organization could offer something more direct. Not speeches, not symbolism, services, violent services. According to federal prosecutors, El Rukin members opened contact with Libyan representatives and discussed carrying out attacks inside the United States in exchange for money. The idea was almost impossible to process. A Chicago street gang offering domestic violence for hire to a foreign government. This was not ordinary gang crime anymore. It was not a corner dispute. It was not a neighborhood rivalry. It was a street empire reaching toward international terrorism. The FBI moved in with a sting operation. Undercover agents watched, listened, and built the case. El Rukin members were tied to efforts to obtain weapons, including a military-style rocket launcher. When agents raided the fort, they found firearms, grenades, and the evidence needed to turn Jeff Fort from a dangerous Chicago gang leader into a national security defendant. The fall was total. Fort was convicted in a terrorism conspiracy case and given decades in federal prison, adding to the weight of other convictions that already surrounded him. The man once invited into the orbit of presidential politics now belonged to the federal prison system. The boy once called Angel had become the first American convicted in a case of plotting terrorism for a foreign government. That transformation says something important about ambition without limits. Fort had built a structure so large that ordinary street power no longer satisfied him. He wanted recognition beyond Chicago. He wanted money beyond the drug trade. He wanted his organization to matter on a world stage. But when a man who builds power through fear begins to believe his violence is exportable, he does not become more powerful. He becomes easier for history to condemn. And while Fort disappeared deeper into federal custody, Larry Hoover watched from his own prison world and chose a different strategy. Fort reached outward and fell. Hoover turned inward and rebranded. Larry Hoover understood something Jeff Fort's Libya case had made painfully clear. Open ambition could bring federal destruction. Fort had reached outward, toward a foreign government, and the response was overwhelming. Investigators, surveillance, raids, terrorism charges, and a sentence designed to remove him from public life forever. Hoover watched that fall from behind bars, and his own strategy moved in the opposite direction. He did not try to sell violence to the world. He tried to rename it. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Hoover began pulling the gangster disciples away from the broader folk structure and consolidating power around himself. The old alliances that had once made him stronger now became obstacles. The Black Disciples, once part of the same historic merger with David Barksdale's organization, were pushed away. Shared symbols did not prevent conflict. Shared history did not protect unity. The king was narrowing the kingdom. Then came the rebrand. Gangster Disciples became growth and development. The initials stayed the same. The language changed. Instead of presenting the organization as a street gang, Hoover's supporters began presenting it as a movement for community uplift, political engagement, economic development, and peace. Businesses appeared, clothing lines, music promotion, political action. The organization 21st Century Vote helped mobilize people around public issues in city politics. To some people in Chicago, this looked like transformation. A man in prison with influence over thousands was saying the language many exhausted communities wanted to hear. Stop the violence, build businesses, register voters, help the neighborhood, turn the gang into something positive. For families who had lived through years of shootings, funerals, and fear, even the possibility of peace was powerful. But prosecutors saw something else. They saw a mask. Federal investigators argued that beneath the reform language, the criminal enterprise continued. Drug money still moved. Order still traveled. Violence still protected the structure. Nonprofit accounts and community language, according to the government, became tools for hiding power rather than ending it. That is what made Hoover's rebrand so complicated. There were people who wanted to believe in it. There were people who feared rejecting it. There were politicians who understood the scale of his influence, and there were investigators listening from inside the room. The FBI eventually captured meetings, conversations, and evidence that prosecutors said proved Hoover was still directing a massive criminal organization from prison. The image of growth and development as a civic movement collapsed under federal charges: conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, and a continuing criminal enterprise. In 1997, Hoover was convicted in federal court and sentenced to additional life terms. The rebrand had failed to save him, but it revealed something chilling about power. A gang does not always survive by looking like a gang. Sometimes it survives by borrowing the language of the very institutions meant to replace it. Community, development, reform, politics, hope. Those words can be real. They can also be camouflage. And in Hoover's case, the central question never stopped haunting Chicago. Was he trying to change the organization or simply teach it to speak in a language the city wanted to hear? ADX Florence was built for men the government did not want to simply imprison. It was built to contain influence. Out in Chicago, Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover had both learned that leadership could travel without a body. A man could be locked up and still have his name move through streets, prisons, housing projects, churches, political offices, and police files. A sentence could remove him from public view, but not necessarily from power. ADX was designed to break that pattern. In the mountains of Colorado, behind concrete, steel, and silence, the two men who helped divide Chicago ended up inside the same federal fortress. Not together, not negotiating, not making peace, not holding court, just contained. For years, rumors circulated that Fort and Hoover had met inside, that the government had let the old rivals sit down, talk reform, or discuss peace. The story was almost too perfect. Two aging kings finally face to face, trying to undo what they had built. But ADX Florence was not designed for symbolism like that. It was designed for isolation. Cells are small, contact is limited, movement is controlled, sound is swallowed by concrete. The point is not only to punish a body, but to reduce a man's ability to become a signal. That is the final irony. Fort and Hoover spent their lives building systems larger than themselves. They built names that could move through neighborhoods without them being there. They built symbols young men would follow long after the original arguments were forgotten. They built coalitions that turned city blocks into borders. And then both men were placed in a prison built to make human beings disappear from the networks they once controlled. Fort remained tied to a mountain of sentences, including the terrorism conspiracy that turned his name into a national security case. Hoover, decades later, would receive a federal commutation in 2025, but the headline did not mean freedom. His Illinois state sentence remained tied to the killing of William Pookie Young, the 19-year-old whose death had started Hoover's long fall into prison. So the two prison kings stayed separated from the city they once shaped. No throne, no council, no South Side corners answering directly to their voices. But outside the walls, the border remained. Not because Fort and Hoover were still personally standing on those corners, but because the systems they helped create had outlived their bodies, their youth, and their freedom. And that leaves the final question. If the kings are gone, why does the border they drew still remain? Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover should not be remembered as kings. That word makes the story sound cleaner than it was. Kings have kingdoms. What they built were systems of fear, loyalty, money, and memory, systems that turned neighborhoods into borders and young lives into territory. They had gifts. Fort could unite people. Hoover could organize power. In another world, those gifts might have built something that healed the communities they came from. But in Chicago, those gifts became machinery. Folk, people, 5, 6. Names that could decide where someone stood before anyone asked who they were. The tragedy is not only that Fort and Hoover ended up behind concrete walls. The deeper tragedy is that the city kept carrying the map after the men were gone. Families still had to remember which blocks were safe. Young people still inherited conflicts they did not create. A symbol could still mean more than a person's name. The kings are locked away, but the border they drew was never made of walls. It was made of fear, memory, and young lives forced to choose a side before they ever had a choice.